Welcome. I'm Chuck Green with the Thinking Clearly channel. Today I want to do an autopsy of the autopsy, meaning that David Plouffe, Jen O'Malley, Stephanie Cutter all sat down with Pod Save America to do their first interview since the election about what happened, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I want to take us through it and talk about what they had to say. Before we do that, I want to just get started and say a few things. I want to say that they had a very hard task handed to them. There's no question about it. When Biden finally announced that he was stepping aside, 2 weeks, I should say, after his disastrous debate, there was only 107 days between that Saturday that Biden announced it and the election day. 107 days is not a lot. And they had to sell Kamala Harris to America. Believe it or not, while you and I may very well know who these political players are, most people in America don't pay a whole lot of attention. So they really had to just introduce her to begin with and then sell her. I also want to say that they were fighting an uphill battle. There's no question about it. Overall, I think they did a pretty good job. I gave them a lot of credit. However, I do think that they made 3 significant mistakes. Before we go to their interview with Podcast America, I want to show you a couple of clips from the video I made about 2 or 3 weeks before they did that interview. And I posted it, I don't know how many of you have seen it, where I mentioned the mistakes I saw. What's interesting is when we get to that video, you're going to see that they addressed all the things that I happened to bring up in my video, before they even did it. So let's start here, and let's see. And going to get this started. Sorry for the delay. Okay. So I want to start with my comments on here, and we can go from there. I'll interject here and there, but I'm going to let this play and throughout their interview too, unless I have something to say, and I will have things to say. But let's get it started. Then, of course, we had the debate with Trump and Biden, which was beyond a disaster. I mean, we all know that. That night I knew that Biden was cooked, and so did everybody else. I mean, that was the end. There was not even a question of that. What I do blame him about is it took him 2 full weeks to resign after that. 2 weeks. I mean, everybody knew what a disaster it was. We could see it, with our own eyes. And it took 2 weeks. I mean, it cost precious time for Harris to get started. I think she did a pretty good job. I think her handlers and the people at the top, David Plouffe and his team, screwed up in a few major ways that cost the election, that maybe we could have won. And I think that one of them was, and this should have been planned, this should have been pre-planned, they should have had an answer for this ready to go. When they asked Harris what she would do differently than Biden, she broke Gaines 101. Rule 1 is you have to differentiate yourself from your opponent, and you also have to differentiate yourself from the administration that you're from, because you're going to start a new administration, and you have to have your own ideas and be your own individual. And when she answered that she wouldn't do anything different, that was a disaster. That showed people that she wasn't her own thinker. She had no other plans, and she would just be a second term of the Biden administration. I think that was very, very, very costly, and I think it was a huge mistake. The problem with the DNC, before we move on, I just want to make a quick comment that when we get to the interview and they talk about this exact issue, I'm shocked at their excuses and reasoning for having not done what I still think that they should have done. And I'm not the experts, they are, but
This just seems so obvious to me, and you'll just see. But it's shocking.
Yeah. And this election cycle was that the DNC tried to be everything to everybody, and they tried to have such a big tent that they were covering everybody, and you can't do that. You cannot solve and join far left people and Wall Street people into with the same goals. It just doesn't work. You can't be everything to everybody, and that's what the DNC has tried to do this last cycle. Actually, the last 2 cycles, and it just doesn't work. Oh, the other thing that I think they made a mistake with is by being such a big tent, and they never criticized anything on the far left, and they didn't criticize anything about the theys and the thems and the pronouns and the trans and this and that, and it opened up a window for Trump to go after, and he did it in a big way. As we all know, he ran those anti-trans ads, and that resonated with a lot of people. These are the things I think is why we lost the election. I'm going to start with number one, and that's Biden. Biden in 2020 had promised to be a transitional president. He had said that he would be a one-term president, be transitional to a younger generation. And then when it came time, he didn't do it. He said, I'm going to run again. And of course, that didn't allow for any primary elections, so it didn't allow for other people to come to the fore and build coalitions. And they allowed Trump to come in and define the trans issue, and he ran those ads about the bathrooms, which really is a small part. And I happen to agree. I really think that what happened was Trump, he's charismatic. He's Teflon Don. Nothing sticks to him. We all know about his legal issues. We all know that he's a criminal and he's a crook. I mean, that's well known and well documented for the last 40 years. We know who he is. But he was also a TV star, and he is charismatic, and nothing sticks to him. And every time something came up, his poll numbers went up instead of down, as we know. So I think that people looked at him and they said, he's charismatic, he's a celebrity, I know who he is. And everybody ignored all the noise about the far right, Project 2025, fascism, and his legal issues. And they said, you know what? I'd rather be safe from immigrants, from those terrible immigrants, than having to share a women's bathroom with a man. And I really think that's how people thought. And that's how they landed on Trump, especially the undecideds, and enough people in the middle there said, I just feel safer with Trump than I feel with this crazy stuff with a man in the women's bathroom. And that was it. And I think we gave them that opportunity because we just left that wide open for them to come and attack. So I think that was another very big, costly mistake.
Okay, so I want to, all right, this is where the video starts for the interview with Podcast America, so let's start there.
America, I'm Dan Pfeiffer. We have a special show for you today.
Dan Pfeiffer.
I'm here in Washington, D.C., where I'm about to sit down with the leadership of the Harris-Walz campaign for their first interview about what happened in the election. Last week, Michael Tyler, who's the communications director for the campaign, called me and said that they were ready to speak and that they wanted to have that conversation on Pod Save America. This is the first time that any of them have done an interview since the election. They don't pretend to have all the answers here. There's way more to cover than we could possibly cover in one podcast. This is the beginning of a conversation about understanding what happened in 2024 and learning the lessons that Democrats are going to need going forward. Joining me here in the studio in Washington were Jenna Dillon, who ran the Harris-Walz campaign, Quentin Fulks, who's the deputy campaign manager and oversaw paid advertising, Stephanie Cutter, who oversaw messaging and communications, and joining by Zoom is David Plouffe, who consulted on all of it. Thank you for doing this. Very much appreciate you having this conversation. Margin of error race, you need a high turnout. What did your polls tell you where the race was heading into Election Day?
Well, Dan, you and I talked prior to the election, and just to rewind, I think when Kamala Harris became the nominee, she was behind. We kind of, climbed back. And even post-debate, we still had ourselves down, in the battleground states, but very close. And so I think by the end, it was a jump ball race, and I think we needed some things to break our way. Maybe Trump's election day turnout would underperform. Our election day turnout would, either be at level or overperform. And, we'd win more of the people who decided in the last 3 or 4 days. I think our data and the New York Times data and other public data suggested we did have some progress with undecideds at late October. So it was a dead heat race. But, at the end of the day, the political atmosphere was pretty brutal. And that's not an excuse. You had right track, wrong track, I think 28-72, about 70% of the country saying they were angry and dissatisfied. You had Trump's approval rating on his first term, frustratingly high, 48-51, depending on the state. Obviously, the incumbent president's approval rating around 38-41, depending on the state. I think the economy and inflation still driving a lot of votes. So I think given that we had a challenging political environment, the fact that we got the race to dead heat was positive, but boy, it was slow moving. And I think we were focused on 7 states. That's our windshield into the world, the battleground states. But, what we on election day was, New Jersey and California and Connecticut and New York, massive shifts. So I think where Kamala Harris campaigned, we were able to keep the tide down a little bit, but it ended up being a pretty strong, tailwind for Donald Trump. And I think it's worth reminding everybody, we saw in 22, even though that was a pretty decent Democratic year, we saw these shifts. We saw them in 20, we saw them in 16. Trump specifically, but Republicans generally, improving their vote share amongst non-college voters, particularly non-college voters of color. And this was a surprising race because Kamala Harris actually did, I think, better with senior voters than I think a lot of people would have thought. So margin of error race where we inherited a deficit, we got it to even, but the thing never moved. So to Jen's point, I think we were hopeful. I don't know how optimistic we were, but we thought, okay, this is tied, and if a couple things break our way, and listen, I'm naive in this way. I just thought at the end of the day, particularly because Trump did not close well, I thought, and I thought Kamala Harris closed well. Trump was reminding people some of the things they don't like about him, that might give us what we needed. But at the end of the day, I think the political atmosphere, the desire for change, all those fundamentals that you've spent a lot of time talking about, really presented huge challenges for us. So, we got there, but we didn't get the breaks we needed on Election Day.
Before we go on, he makes the comment at the beginning of that or in the middle of that they had seen this trend in 2020, even in 2016, and then 2022 about people moving to the right. And what baffles me is you have the party still between the far left and the center, and they're not acting or campaigning in a center-right way as they usually have done over the last 50 years. And they've moved to the left. And when you do that, you're giving up that moderate vote, especially, the moderate right, some of the possible Republican that might vote for a Democrat. But knowing that, I don't understand how they positioned it.
Deep was the hole that she had to climb out of.
Well, Jen, I think, listen, there was the Biden-Trump 1.0, which is obviously pretty catastrophic in terms of where the race stood. When we got in, my recollection is some of that snapped back, but, we were behind. I think it surprised people because there was these public polls that came out in late September, early October, showing us with leads that we never saw. It was just basically a race that in the battlegrounds was 46-47, 47-48. So that's not where we started. We started behind. She was able to climb out. I think even after the debate, we might have gained, 0.51. It wasn't a race that moved a lot. And so I think when you think about our own internal analytics, if you have Wisconsin at 47-47, or Pennsylvania 48-47 Trump, let's say, which I think is where we had it at the end, you've got to have undecided to break your way more than your opponents, and you've got to get a little benefit from turnout, which we weren't able to do.
Obviously, the defining event of this race was the candidate switch. And every decision you guys had to make, everything you had to do was defined also by the compressed calendar in which you were operating in. Quentin, you were there when that switch happened. How were you able?
I apologize. I forgot to mention that Quentin was also there in the interview. I'm sorry about that.
The 1 month period between the debate and when the president actually dropped out. Obviously, it seemed like dropping out could be a possibility. Were you able to do any thinking or planning in that 1 month period about what a race with the vice president would look like, or did you have to sort of start cold on that first day, the moment you got the call or the statement went out?
I mean, we started cold. There was no planning involved in any other candidates. I mean, we were honestly in crisis management mode of keeping President Biden in the race, convincing, Democratic allies that he could still do this. And one of the things was trying to keep the president out on the road as much. We were still doing everything we could from the campaign, and he made the decision that he did not want to continue on. And he pulled some of the senior leadership together and said that he was going to be with the vice president. It also wasn't anything that our team took for granted to just say, okay, she's the nominee. We knew that there was still a situation where we had to shore up delegates, and that's where we started from. And then after that point, that is when we began to say, okay, how can we define her? Also, Trump's favorabilities numbers were creeping up, as Plouffe said, and we had to do something about that as well. And so it was a lot of walking and chewing gum at the same time, but there really was no sort of contingency planning to turn the race over to her right after that debate or at any point until President Biden definitively said he wasn't going to continue on.
The first thing we had to do is put on a convention, and we had about 3 weeks to flip a convention that was being built around Joe Biden. So we were able to flip it, to fit this very new character of a different generation, different experience, different background. And looking at the data at the time, which Jen and Plouffe and Quentin have all talked about, she had a huge deficit in favorability because either people didn't know about her or what they did know about her was based off of negative media. So our first priority was to define her in that convention, which, she was the incumbent, but she really wasn't the incumbent. People didn't know that much about her. The economy was still slightly getting better, but we couldn't really take credit for it. So we were in a bit of a crossroads trying to figure out what that October messaging and closing messaging would look like.
I want to say, before they go on, I think they did a pretty decent convention, especially with the short time that they had to get everything together and fix everything. The only thing I think which was a major screw up, is that they should have had a Palestinian speaker. Even if it was during late afternoon before prime time, the Palestinians said they would have been okay with that, and they said no. And I think that was a mistake. I think that they could have put out that olive branch to the Palestinian voters, and I think it would have gone a long way.
When you have a race where you've got the current incumbent president with approval ratings of, let's say, 38 to 40. Never in history have we had this before, at least since, I guess, Grover Cleveland. So once you have a former president running where 48 to 51% of the people approve of his first term, and people are dissatisfied with the direction of the country, you have to raise the stakes of what a second term would be like. So I think for us, we spent much more time trying to raise the stakes of a second term than re-arbitrating the first, because voters just weren't open to that. So that's why pointing out, his tariff and what that would mean in terms of a huge sales tax for the American people, the fact that he's more unhinged, he wants unchecked power. Project 2025 ended up being about as popular as the Ebola virus. So we did a lot of good work there. And now, of course, the son of a bitch lied about it, and he's hiring everybody who authored it. Project 2025 is going to be the Trump administration agenda, as we pointed out. So we had to do that. So if we had just run a race solely on Kamala Harris positives, though we did a lot of that, on what Kamala Harris wants to do on the economy, we did a lot of that. It's worth reminding your listeners who live in California, New York, or Alabama or Florida, you're not experiencing the presidential race as it's experienced in Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina.
I think that's very true. I was not in a swing state, and I think that we didn't see a lot of what was going on in those swing states.
She spent a lot of time driving a core economic message. But in our view, that was not enough. When you've got someone whose first term was judged favorably enough by enough people to give him the election, and people are dissatisfied about where you are now, and you're part of that administration, you have to basically raise the stakes. And for us, it was on the economy. It was on the fact that all the people who stood in his way last time were warning us about him. It was about Project 2025. It was about abortion. And, I think we did a good job of that based upon our data, but we had to stay on that. So I think that is an incredibly faulty reading, that what we should have done is just lift up Kamala Harris. We clearly did. Her favorability rating increased by, I believe, 15 points. If you look at who do you trust more to look out for people like your family, who do you think is going to fight for the middle class? Huge progress for Kamala Harris. Even on crime and immigration, we were able to make double-digit progress. So we were very focused on lifting her up. But to win a race like this, given the political atmospherics, which were quite challenging, we had to raise the risk of a Trump second term.
Jen, you guys are obviously operating in a very, very tough political environment. Incumbent president, very low approval ratings, as Plouffe mentioned, wrong track, right track, approval of the economy, all very challenging. Also, in at least the public polling, huge desire for change, right? Frustration with the status quo. Not just that's here in the United States, but we've seen that across the world since COVID. Challenging place to be if you were the vice president to the unpopular incumbent president. Felt like much of the convention, as Stephanie mentioned, was trying to make her a change candidate, talk about turning the page. So can you talk a little about how you tried to do that and whether you think she could or should have done more to distance herself from President Biden? Something that I think, as evidenced by the answer on The View, she was at least personally
There you go.
comfortable with.
Well, yeah, look, first of all, I think people, when they vote for president, want to vote about the future. And they saw in the vice president someone they didn't know a lot about a background. So, who she was, what she stood for, what she did as vice president. So in every step of what we were trying to do, we had to tell a pretty robust story in one ad or one policy rollout or one event that you don't often have to do because of the time we were in. But I do think that we really focused from the get-go on how she was different than everyone else, different than Joe Biden, different than Donald Trump. And at the end of the day, the choice was her versus Donald Trump. And at the same time, she was very clear that she was a new generation of leadership, but it wasn't just like a statement. It was, here's what I need to focus on. Her first policy announcements were economic, talking about housing, talking about lowering costs, understanding that people really didn't feel like things were progressing in the way that they wanted to, a la the right track, wrong track data, but how she brought her own point of view to thinking about housing, sandwich generation. That was probably her biggest applause line, one of the best testing things that we did. That wasn't a poll tested, let's work on this poll, this data to tell us this is the right issue we should go talk about. That was about her life and also understanding what people in the country were really needing. So I think that in a 107-day race, it is very difficult to do all the things you would normally do in a year and a half, 2 years. But I think wherever we had an opportunity, the vice president did put her own stamp on this and did it in a deeper way than I think probably we got the kind of full breadth of coverage on it. Of course, when you have an administration that a lot of progress has been made and you're part of that progress, it's complicated when you're asked questions in certain ways. But at the end of the day, I think she really, every time she turned, talked to a voter, every time she was out on the stump, she really leaned into her own vision. But the headwinds were tough. I will also, though, add, of course, we lost. So I'm not here to say that didn't happen. We would much rather not have that happen. But where she campaigned, we did way better than the rest of the country. And Donald Trump did worse, to the point that you were just talking about with Plouffe. The idea that people have just a well-constructed, already baked-in idea about Trump and they don't need to learn anymore, it's just complete fallacy. His numbers are stronger today than they have ever been.
Yeah.
And that was critical for us. And we also believe this race was not just about Kamala Harris. It was Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump, and we had to set that choice and that frame up. And I think that we were able to, anywhere we campaigned in all 7 of these states, where Donald Trump, by the way, campaigned too. He did worse and we did better. And we did make real progress against these national headwinds. If in every other state but the battlegrounds there was a negative 8-point shift to the right, in the battlegrounds there was only 3. So we needed it to be better than that. And perhaps if we had more time, we could have done that. But I think that's fundamental, that when people learned more about her, understood what she stood for, where she came from, and what her vision was, they responded well to that, and they responded in a favorable way, especially in contrast to, a point of view that Donald Trump will be worse, and I think that's playing out right now.
The post-election analysis, there's been a ton of focus on the very ubiquitous trans ad that the Trump campaign spent tens of millions of dollars on. There have been sort of two strains of thought of this. One, the sense that her position and the Democratic Party position on trans-related issues were one of the reasons why we lost, but also real questions about why the campaign decided not to respond to the ad specifically. My understanding from reporting, at least, is that you guys tested a bunch of responses and they didn't work. Just tell me your thinking there and what role you think that ad and those issues actually played in the race.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's important to put everything into context. We've very well established a time frame. And it's honestly a lot shorter than 107 days, but we had three core objectives to the paid media. It was to define the vice president. It was to defend her on incoming attacks, and a lot of these attacks have been baked in for the past 3.5 years. While she was the vice president, they were attacking her. She was at negative 20 something on immigration. We got that down to negative 10. Trump had a positive 22-point advantage on the economy. We got that down to 7. And we had to respond to those things. And when you sort of looked at the core issues, aside from the attacks, like trans issues are just at the bottom for voters.
That may be true when you ask for a list of things, but it's not true when it comes to emotional triggers. And the trans issue is an emotional trigger. If somebody asks you what are your top 5 things, it may not even be in the top 5, but they use it very effectively. As a matter of fact, you're going to hear them say that Trump's budget, they spent 7% of the money on those trans ads. So it was very effective. And I think that, they made the mistake of being too far left. And I have my own thoughts on this whole ideology, and I don't think in 10 years we're going to look back and be living in the world that we're living in today. And I think it's a big mistake, and I think it did cost, because it's a trigger issue.
Economy, inflation, crime, immigration are the top issues. They were also some of the issues that she was getting attacked on. And to the element of sort of defining her and doing it in a way that sort of fit within what you're trying to do, there's a direct approach that you can take to anything, and then there is an approach that you can take that accomplishes 2 of the 3 objectives. A lot of the stuff that we did, such as talking about her prosecutorial background, and then saying that she went after transnational gangs, cartels, it was to push back pseudolly on the immigration attacks that were coming at her, as well as credentialing her background on things that were absent and standalone of the Biden administration. We did a lot of stuff about her record as AG, her record as a prosecutor, not as vice president, because it also allowed her to stand alone separate from the Biden administration.
I actually think that was pretty effective, and I think a lot of people by election day really did have a good idea of who she was and about her prosecutions and who she went after. I really do think they did a really good job with that.
On the trans attack, obviously it was a very effective ad at the end. I ultimately don't believe that it was about the issue of trans. I think that it made her seem out of touch. And it was sort of a pseudo-economic ad underneath it, because he was saying you're going to pay for it with taxpayer money. And it was in her own words. And that's something. But we tested a ton of responses to this, direct responses. And none of them ever tested as well as basically her, talking about what she would do, to Jen's point, the future, the type of...
They left that wide open because their whole policy in supporting this stuff could have been taken away if they had not supported it, and defined maybe some of the things that we're with you on this, but we're not with you on that. But instead, they let him define her on this issue, and but that's why I agree. I don't think there was any ad that could have offset that. To be honest with you, I think it's just the whole concept of allowing it in the campaign.
President that she would be. There were elements of it where we did try to say, and we put ads on television of her saying, "You've seen all the negative attacks against me," and try to bottle it up, because I also think you have to think about the entire sentiment when you're running a paid campaign. And the trans ad, I think because of the content, a lot of people felt like it was much bigger than what it was. But to put that into context, Team Red, meaning Trump and all the super PACs that were spending on Trump's behalf, that was 7% of their total ads was on that issue.
Dan, on the Biden question, we of course got that everywhere.
Here we go. This is my number one gripe, and this just slays me.
We went. And we knew what the data was. We knew we had to show her as her own person and point to the future and not try to rehash the past. But she also felt that she was part of the administration. And unless we said something like, well, I would have handled the border completely differently, we were never going to satisfy anybody. So we did talk about things like...
Absolutely disagree. And I don't think it was about attacking Biden.
She's a different generation. Most of her career is from outside of Washington, not inside Washington. So she knows a lot of the best ideas are from across the country. Her career has been about reaching across the aisle, finding common sense ways to get things done. It's not been based in ideological politics. All of these things, we were trying to tell a story.
It wasn't enough. And after the fact, after she was asked that question about what she would do differently, and said basically I wouldn't do anything differently because I agree with everything Joe did, it's a disaster. I mean, that should have set off alarm bells across the campaign saying we have to address this and we have to distinguish her from Joe. I think they should have done some type of grand gesture. I don't know exactly what that is. That's for these guys to figure out. They're paid big bucks. But maybe something with the Ukraine strategy, maybe naming a cabinet, before, telling who she might, pick in a cabinet. I don't know, but some type of grand gesture that would have separated her from Joe. And I also don't think that they were that afraid of the press, saying, oh, she didn't like Joe doing this or she didn't like doing that. I think it depends on what they would have picked and how they would have framed it. And that's their job. They're the pros at this. And I just find this to be bullshit.
And give the impression that she was different without pointing to a specific issue.
Can I ask this why not a specific issue? Is it something she was unwilling to do? You worried it would feel disingenuous or?
Because she felt like she was part of the administration. So why should she look back and pick?
I don't believe that that's the case. She's blaming her, saying she was part of it, so therefore I don't want to criticize. I don't buy it.
Cherry pick some things that she would have done differently when she was part of it. And she had tremendous loyalty to President Biden. And, if we had...
That was their job to help her work around that and get a message out how she wasn't going to be, Biden 2 administration.
Said... just imagine this. You've been on plenty of campaigns. Imagine if we said, well, we would have taken this approach on the border. Imagine the round of stories coming out after that of people saying, well, she never said that in a meeting, or what meeting when she said this, or I remember when she did that. And it was just...
More excuses.
It wasn't going to give us what we needed because it wouldn't be a clean break. It would be... days upon days in a limited time window that we had.
Nonsense.
Of dealing of who, what, when, where. So the best we could do, and the most that she felt comfortable with, was saying, look, vice presidents never break with their presidents. The only time in recent memories when Pence broke with Trump.
She didn't have to break. She could have said, I would go further on something. I would expand something. There were so many possibilities that she could have defined herself as separate from him.
After Trump stormed the Capitol. So Biden's not...
They call that the murder exemption. If the president tries to murder you, you can break, yes.
If you are, ripping up the Constitution, trying to overturn an election, people die, then you can break with your president. But absent that... Vice presidents stick by their presidents. And she wasn't willing to, change that precedent for whoever the future president-vice presidential partnership would be, because it would mean a whole, different set of problems as if we don't have enough problems in our democracy right now. So unless we were willing to say, Biden said green and she said blue on any particular issue, we were never really going to satisfy that. So our focus was.
Absolutely disagree. I think it's malpractice on their part that they couldn't have figured out some way to differentiate her in a grand way that would have resonated.
Let's look to the future. Let's describe her and her approach to things. Let's use policies, future-looking policies, to demonstrate that difference. But in the end, we've all seen the data. Too many people thought that you'd be a continuation, which.
Hello, and why is that? It's because of your lack of messaging.
On the economy was, the incumbent killer.
Quentin,
Go on Joe Rogan. Would it have changed anything? It would have been it would have broken through, not because of the conversation with Joe Rogan, but because the fact that she was doing it. And that was really the benefit of it. Will she do it sometime in the future? Maybe. Who knows? But it, didn't ultimately impact the outcome one way or the other.
How in the world does she know that? How in the world does she know that? Donald Trump had something along the order of 60 million views of his interview on Joe Rogan. Can you imagine if Kamala Harris had actually gone to Austin and sat down for 3 hours? What if she got 20 million views, 30 million views, 40 million views? She didn't have to get 60. Can you imagine 40 million views looking at her? How do we know it wouldn't have changed the dynamic? It wouldn't have changed the numbers. It wouldn't have had any effect. I think that is just so not just naive. It blows my mind. 20 million, 30 million people, she might have convinced enough people on the margin that it might have made a difference. You can't make a statement like that. And I do think it was malpractice. And I do think it was an error for her not to go on Joe Rogan.
But she was willing to do whatever it takes.
Yeah, Dan. So what's clear is we offered to do it in Austin. People should know that. Didn't work out. I think, maybe they leveraged that to get Trump in studio. I don't know. And
that's not really the full story. The full story is that she wanted to do it, I guess, and they couldn't figure out the schedule. From what I understand, when she went down to have that Houston rally, and then Donald came in and he did that, and Joe Rogan had said to her campaign, the same as Donald, that she had to come to a studio as Donald did and do the full 3-hour interview as most people do in his studio in Austin. And my understanding is that Plouffe and Company offered that he would have to come to her, and the most that they would give her would be about an hour. So this isn't the straight poop here, and they're sugarcoating this.
We were obviously not going to be back in Texas, but offered to do it on the road.
and he wouldn't travel.
They offered on the road, and that's she should give me a break. She should have gotten on a plane and flown to Austin. It's not like she didn't fly everywhere else all the time. Yeah, it's not a plausible excuse.
Right. No.
Yeah, I agree with Stephanie. I don't know at the end of the day how much it would have driven vote. But listen, the reason that we...
Again, 20, 30, 40 million views? How do you know?
The night of the first debate, challenged Trump to a second debate. We were going to do that whether that first debate went good, bad, or indifferent. We needed big moments. We were behind in the race with a candidate who was not fully defined.
Trump.
And again, I just want to, it can sound like making excuses. This political environment sucked, okay? We were dealing with ferocious headwinds. And I think people's instinct was to give the Republicans and even Donald Trump another chance. So we had a complicated puzzle to put.
Why? Why did they want to give him another chance? Because they didn't see her candidacy or her presidency as being any different than the last 4 years under Biden. And that's because of your messaging.
Together here in terms of the voters. And it was going to take a little bit more independent Republicans than we saw in 20. Maybe 1% more Republican voters for us. It was going to take voters saying, even though I judged Trump's first term favorably, I'm more concerned about him this time. We had to get more voters to say that. So, and if you look at how we closed, I think we
But it went the other way. So there's something else going on here in your messaging. It's just not that simple.
did one day with Liz Cheney in the last couple of weeks. You look at the ads we ran, they were heavily centered.
I don't think Cheney made much difference one way or the other, and I don't think people didn't vote because they brought Cheney in.
On the economy, on tax cuts, on Trump being for the wealthy. So this notion that somehow we weren't focused on the economy, that was the driving motivation and message in our campaign. The
I agree. I have no issue with that was their messaging.
closing speech, yes, it took place at the Ellipse, was a huge contrast on the economy and the people Donald Trump would fight for and the people Kamala Harris would fight for. So I think that mistakes, I think my concern about that is just, again, we have to understand that what happened in this election and what didn't. And, I think at the end of the day, we had to raise people's concern and the threat level of a Trump second term. I think if you look at our internal data, and Quentin can speak to this, we did a lot of that. We just didn't get it to the extent that we needed to win. But at the end of the day, I think people, it was the price of eggs that drove a lot of the debate here. And I think Trump's going to be in hot water because he's going to do a lot of stuff starting January 20th. That's not going to be about the price of eggs. It's going to be about sort of the MAGA ideological pursuits that he and his base will insist happen, whether that's pardoning January 6th rioters or some of the other things around healthcare and immigration. So, but I think, Dan, that it is important. We spent a lot of time with voters in the aftermath of those comments from Milley and about, desiring generals like Hitler, and it bothered voters. So again, that wasn't the core of our campaign. The core of our campaign was an economic contrast in these battleground states, but it was an important element of it.
Quentin, keep
Dominating in the middle, not just winning it a little. We have to dominate the moderate vote.
Then you have to become more moderate.
And I think as we look ahead to 26 and 28, particularly where you have seen drift amongst non-college voters generally, particularly those of color specifically, we obviously have to get some of that back. We can't afford any more erosion there. The math just doesn't fucking work, okay? But I don't think this is a permanent
His eloquence is correct here.
realignment. But the point here is to win battleground states. Yes, of course you have to maximize your turnout and your vote share amongst liberal voters if you're a Democrat. That was a huge focus. You've got to win the center.
A decrease in support cycle after cycle, which we were able to hold off this time. So I think there is a lot more work to do to kind of understand this more and think about it. But I don't think it is the work of just a 107-day campaign or even a presidential campaign. And I think that's probably the biggest answer of where do we go from here on all of this. How do we ensure that people in this country see themselves in what we're selling and that we have solutions that make sense to people and that we can understand what they're going through and that they see themselves reflected in those solutions. And, I think there's just a lot of work that, to me, it is never going to be we have to make choices about one type of voter versus another, but everyone has to see, not just our brand as a party, but more importantly, our candidates as people who are providing solutions and really can make connections and that there's a path for that. And I think
Well, that's where it cut off. That was the end of it. She had made her point. And I think it was very interesting. From my commentary, you know how I feel.
But I have to say, these.
Oh, sorry. And let me just make sure that that's gone. Okay. And we have to go forward. I mean, I'm glad to have this off my chest. I definitely was angry. And when I hear this, it makes me even angrier. Because I do think there were some significant errors made. And I don't think that this autopsy is enough. I think they have a lot to think about, and I think that the party has a lot to think about and where they want to be. They need new messaging, they need new people, they need a new strategy. And I can tell you it's not in this far left stuff. There's no way you're going to get back the increasing people voting on the right by far left stuff. And I do think that Trump is going to hand us, starting January 20th, and then certainly in the first 100 days, a hell of a lot to talk about and a hell of a lot to fight about. And I agree with David Plouffe that, with Project 2025, he's going to scare the shit out of people. And people are not going to be happy with what they're going to see happening in this country. But unfortunately, we have 4 years until we can do much about it, 2 years until the next congressional. But that's it. So I had made another couple of videos about Trump's picks. I don't really want to go much into it right now, but I do want to reiterate what I said in those other videos, is I don't think Head South is going to make it. I think that's pretty obvious at this point. I really question whether Kash Patel is going to make it. He has no business being anywhere near the FBI. We all know that. And I think he'll be stopped. And the other one I think is Tulsi Gabbard. She has no business being the DNI, absolutely none whatsoever. And I am hopeful that those three are going to be passed on and they'll be replaced with some other people. As I talked about with Pam Bondi versus Matt Gaetz, while I don't like her politics and all that stuff, at least she's a qualified person. So, and I think we'll see more of that type of thing coming in. JFK Jr. scares the crap out of me. The damage that he can do to the health of not just in the country, but to the world is so scary. Anyway, I want to thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this and got something out of it. I had cut down about a 95-minute interview, if I remember correctly, down to about 25 minutes from Pod Save America. And thought I would bring you just, basically the highlights. There was a lot of other things discussed that really have nothing, that really weren't important for our topic. Anyway, please comment below what your thoughts are. Please subscribe and share this video with your friends. And like, subscribe, and comment below. And we'll see you on the next one. Thank you.